I was recently hosting a webinar and someone asked, how would you make a boring course with lots of reading engaging and gamified? I gave her a quick answer, but there's actually a lot to unpack there. So in this video, I'm going to take a content dump course and give you a couple ways you can use gamification to make it more effective. So yeah, how would you make a boring course with lots of reading, engaging, and gamified? The person's asking about learner engagement, and that's often because an engaged learner will pay more attention and persevere more, so that'll make the training more effective. That's usually what people are assuming correctly when they try to gamify their training. But in my years of making gamified training, I've found that if you only focus on the engagement part, that is, if you only add fun for its own sake, the game mechanics can come off as a gimmick which can actually disengage the learner. Imagine going to a class and the trainer makes you play musical chairs for 15 minutes just for fun. If the game doesn't have a point that's relevant to the topic, you'll probably wonder, why are we doing this? So seeking to engage is a good thing, but you need to make that engagement relevant and productive. And when learners feel that the fun is relevant, they'll be happy to engage with it. So effectiveness leads to engagement too. And that's the engine that we want to leverage in gamified training, so it needs both. But where do you start? Well, there's a lot of ways to have fun, but they're not all productive. Fun can take you in all sorts of directions, but there's only one way for your mechanic to be effective. It has to help the learner reach the learning objective. So you want to start by aiming at effectiveness. That makes sure that the fun that comes from using your mechanics isn't mindless, it's directed fun. So going back to our text-based course, if someone's asking me this question, I assume the course is already built and it looks like this. Content dump, click next, repeat, maybe with a knowledge check somewhere. So what she can do with this obviously depends on how much leeway she has to modify this existing course. So to start thinking about how to modify it, it helps to see gamified training mechanics as being organized kind of like an onion with learning objectives and your content at the core. And when we gamify training, we start at the core and we work our way outwards. The closer your game mechanics are to the core, the more customized and adapted they are to the learning objectives, so they're more relevant to your content. An example of this is a simulator. A gardening simulator is very specific to gardening. Those mechanics tend to be more effective, but they'll usually require more thought and effort on your part to implement. As you move outwards from the core, you're getting into the more superficial elements of games. Here, the mechanics are not as content dependent, so they tend to be more one-size-fits-all types of tactics, like for example, adding points on everything. That's generally a lot less effort to implement, but it's also less relevant to the content and so less likely to be super effective. So if you're modifying an existing course, these surface mechanics are kind of like a band-aid, while reworking the core mechanics is more like open heart surgery. So let's look at what you can do depending on what level you're working at, starting at the core. The first thing that comes to mind is to audit the content. I do that before I even start thinking about game mechanics, because that content is the foundation on which you build the game mechanics. So this is something you do before you gamify. So let's say my text is about the 12 gods of Olympus, and suppose my first learning objective is to know what elements each god has dominion over. So Hades is the god of the underworld, Poseidon the sea, and so on down the line. That's what my learner needs to know. So the first thing I do is I'd look at this wall of text and I'd pull out anything that's not absolutely necessary to the desired outcome. Is there anything here that they don't really need to know in order to reach this learning objective? If so, pull it out. Now I know some of it might be nice to know, it might give some extra information, or there might be some extra fun facts and anecdotes in there. But all of that can be added to resources in the course that are available optionally to the learner. You don't have to put it all in the critical path that every learner has to go through. Streamline that so that it's a shorter path to the learning objective. That way you're being mindful of the learner's time, effort, and attention, and you're letting them decide if they want to know more. And the material that's relevant to the learning objective isn't diluted in a sea of extra information. So now that you're left with only the stuff that's essential to the learning objective, you have to find a more engaging way of teaching it. So now we're getting into gamification, and here I'm just going to focus on two ingredients of engagement. Number one, ideally, you want to keep the learner active. And when I say active, reading doesn't count, listening to narration doesn't count, and clicking next doesn't count. I mean actively thinking about your content. And two, I want the learner to figure things out by themselves, not to be given the answers and then asked to repeat them. So, super simple example of this is I can replace the wall of text by a series of questions posed in such a way that I'm giving them enough information for them to figure out the answer. So instead of telling them who the god of wine is, I can ask them, and here there's enough information on screen for them to correctly guess or deduce it. Okay, this guy's holding grapes, he's the god of wine. I feel clever. And as they go through this series of questions, you can gradually take away information. By the end, they have to rely completely on the knowledge they've acquired so far. So now I'm keeping the learner active and they're figuring things out for themselves, and this series of activities constitutes my assessment as well as my teaching. They're now one and the same. This is just one of many methods that you can use to turn your content into active learning, and there's a ton of these methods depending on what kind of content you have. But this would be a major overhaul of the way the course is presented. If you have less leeway to modify the course, then maybe all you can do is modify the surface elements. And that's when we come to motivational mechanics. These are a lot more common because they're easier to implement, and they usually consist in adding goals and rewards to the existing activities, whatever they are, leaving them intact. But here too, I'm going to give you 2 tips to make these mechanics more effective. First, make sure your rewards or incentives are tied to an intrinsic drive. And second, try to add some uncertainty to the experience. For example, instead of giving the learner a badge for clicking through a module and getting to the end of it, you're better off tying it to an actual performance. Demand a certain threshold score in order to get the badge. If you don't tie it to some challenge, some performance, then it's a foregone conclusion that everyone will get the badge, so who cares? But if you make it a challenge to get the badge, then there's a bit of uncertainty about whether or not your performance will be good enough to get it. And because not everyone gets it, those who do will feel a greater sense of achievement. That's intrinsic. And those who don't may repeat the challenges to try to improve their score beyond just a passing grade. In both cases, the badge is now more meaningful and it says something about the person who got it. Of course, the best way to ensure that your gamified course is really effective is to build your mechanics from the ground up as you're developing the course. But even when that's not possible, as in this case, knowing the principles of engagement can help you determine, among the changes you can make, which ones will make the biggest impact for the amount of effort you can invest. If you want to know more about this process, check out the Effective Gamification Framework. This is my step-by-step roadmap for turning your content into a series of engaging challenges. So check it out in the description below, and I'll see you next time.